Alright, we're gonna get started in a second. Talking about Firebase. I gotta send up the stream.
It was funny because like we make a majority of the women, so like girls the other class it was just both yeah. He was the last yeah. But like it was me in the middle of the room with like two chairs on each side of me and then and in the row so it was like pretty much actually. He's a Carson. Started working together, but yeah, it was like 10 minutes.
Alright. Okay, couple minutes late. Sorry, I was looking at some stuff that I didn't notice until like 2 minutes ago. Today we're going to talk about Firebase. So we're going to get into a server-side database / API that we get to use to persist data, which is pretty cool, right? We can start making like full web apps now. You can actually use Firebase to make a production-ready application, and people do it, which is really cool. So any questions before we get started? Questions on localhost, local storage, session storage, cookies, any of the stuff we went over last class, any of the stuff we've gone over in class so far. Any questions? No? Yeah, Nor? Okay. Sounds good. Sounds good. One quick note is the homework for week 7 that requires Firebase, that train app that we talked about at the end of class, is it's time intensive and it's pretty tough. So the sooner you get started on it, the better. Especially as we start doing Firebase today, and you kind of have it fresh in your mind, being able to try to work through some examples and apply that to that homework right away, at least to get something basic working, will benefit you greatly. So it's recommended that you start that sooner rather than later. So quick recap. What's the difference between client persistence and server persistence, and why would we want either or? Anyone have an idea? Want to weigh in on that? No? No one? Andy?
Yeah, client persistence is more like collaboration, kind of like, you know, you can add to it and more people can work at it at a time.
Okay.
You know, or no, I'm talking about like server based. Sorry.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Like APIs and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Client based is I'm talking like local, right?
Yeah. Client based would be like your local, your browser.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the server side storage, server side persistence has to do a lot with APIs and stuff, right? So everyone can use that persistence at once. It's not on your local machine. It's easy to access from pretty much anywhere, generally speaking. Client-side persistence is basically in your browser, the way we discussed in this class. It's in your browser on your machine. If your browser changes, your website changes, or your machine changes, your local persistence is gone, your client storage, right? So obviously some things we want the whole server storage because we want to share a bunch of data across many computers across the world or the internet, and we don't want all that data on our machines. Whereas we might use client-based storage to do stuff really fast, or if it's sensitive info, if it's something we don't want to share everywhere, or something we don't need to share everywhere, we'll put it on our client to kind of help with that. So there are several advantages to each, and how you use them depends on what you want to do with the data and where it needs to go, right? So hopefully everyone checked out Firebase. It's firebase.google.com. Let me see if I can drag it over here. It's this bad boy. They got a cool little website here. And if you had time, maybe you looked through it. But basically what Firebase is a database that you can get to from online. It's actually a set of services, but the one we're going to focus on is the database that they have. It's called a real-time database because they offer a whole bunch of ways that you can communicate with it in real time. So I can add something to the database, and I can get notifications that something changed in real time, which is pretty awesome. And you see there's a whole bunch of companies that use it. Lyft uses it, Duolingo, Venmo, Shazam. You know, these are services that I'm sure almost all of us have heard of at one point or another, right? So it's pretty powerful, and it's pretty easy to use as well, which is really good and really nice. And they have a very nice, clean interface. Okay, so if I wanted to play with Firebase, I could go ahead and get started. Now I'm already logged in as me, or was logged in as me, but then I logged out. Let me log in. You'd like to know that, wouldn't you? So when you log in, if you create an account, everyone should have created an account or should be creating one right now as we're talking. Eventually you'll get to this console.firebase.google.com. Firebase console, right? This is where everything's going to start with Firebase. So first things first, we can go ahead and add a new project, right? My test project. Call it whatever. They're going to append some random stuff to the end if it's not unique, because every database or every project needs to be unique across the entire Firebase ecosystem. So we create the project. It's going to do some stuff for us to get everything ready. Okay, so it's ready. Go ahead and continue. So now we're in here, we're in this kind of console view, okay? There's a lot going on, but a few things to focus on. Well, the first thing we're going to focus on is this database right here. I click database, you're going to get a page that says a whole bunch of stuff, and it's going to say create database. You don't want to do this one, because that's for the Cloud Firestore. Scroll all the way down, see all Firebase features, and then click on the real-time database. Boop. And we're brought to the database console. Okay, so there's a couple things you'll notice here. One, there's some tabs up here to, go over what you can do with the database, backups, usage, some things with rules that we'll go over in just a moment in data. This right here, this little white block, is where all my data will be viewed once I've added to Firebase. Literally, this is it. It's a nice, clean UI. It's real easy to use. You can go ahead and collapse this so you can see more information. And everything I do will be shown in here. There's also this URL. This URL is the direct URL to the server where my data is being stored. You're not really going to need it other than with our integrations, at least for today. With our integrations, we'll need it in our configuration settings so that we can talk to the appropriate database. But it's just good to know that this is where it's stored. So this is an API. It's a database that is accessed through an API that's on the internet, right? So there's a web server somewhere that's doing all this fun stuff for us, hosted by Google. Now, one quick side note, I am not an expert on Firebase. I've actually never used it in a production app, and the extent of my usage is pretty much the hour I spent last night playing with it to try to understand it enough to teach you guys. So there might be questions you'll ask that I won't necessarily know the answer to today, but I'll find out, and for Wednesday I'll give you the answer. But I'll probably know a lot of the basic stuff, so we'll get those taken care of. Just want to let you guys know that I'm not bullshitting you. This isn't something I'm a massive expert on, and I'm kind of learning too as we go on. So anyway, this is the gist of it. While we're creating our database, let's take care of some house cleaning stuff. There's this rules tab, and I'm encouraging everyone to be following along at this point, because I'm not going to go over it again. So you should have a project made. You should be at the database section, right? Most people there. And then once you're here, there's this rules tab, okay? And in the rules tab, you'll see rules and a .read and a .write. Those need to be true. Just like that. Once they're true, you can hit publish, and your new rules are published. The reason why these are set to true, well, Firebase has lots of authentication mechanisms that you can use to properly log into your database and prevent unwanted guests, right? And unfortunately, today we're not going to go over those. So by setting read and write to true, we're giving anyone unlimited access to this database. What does that mean? Well, it means if someone happened to find all the configuration information, which is highly unlikely, they could spam this database into oblivion, and Google will probably shut it down since you don't have a credit card on file. Yeah?
The two options to create a database, one said text, that also puts it in public mode, right?
Does it?
Yeah.
Well, you can hit the test mode for a database and automatically put it in public mode. But just note that this rules right here, you're going to have to potentially change them if you didn't make a test database. Alright, everyone with me? Good. That one yes is my encouragement to continue forward. Yeah. Any questions on what we've done so far? Any questions? Real basic stuff on Firebase? Questions on anything we've just talked about? Basically, we got a database somewhere out in the ether, and we can now connect to it, which is all well and good, but we'll see why this is exciting in just a moment. Okay. So, I was playing around. They give us, as instructors, access to their database. So, right here is a shared one. And there's this click count, and you'll notice it's changing. I'm clicking a button on an HTML page. As a matter of fact, I'm changing a button on this HTML page, or clicking a button on this HTML page, if I can ever bring it over, my god. Right here. Let's see if I can get it to take up half the screen. Oh my word! This is not cooperating. That's okay. Come on, buddy. Come on. Alright. Well, anyway, let's see what it's at right now. 17, 18, 19, 20. You can see what's amazing is this database that, you know, is apparently in the ether. I'm changing the data and I can see it in real time update in front of me, which is pretty cool. You can imagine if you have a couple monitors, you know, and you're testing out some code, and you're like, oh, hey, you know, I want to save a user or save, you know, some trivia information or save a train like you'll be doing in your homework. You can set everything up and then you can watch the database change as you do stuff. Kind of an extra level of debugging help there, right? So that's pretty neat. Well, why don't we look at what this code happens to be? How complicated is this? The answer is thankfully not very. So, there's a few things going on. We have our normal jQuery CDN link. We have a little button, all well and good. And then we have another CDN link to the Firebase code, which I will show you how to access in just a moment, because there's more than just this. You need this to be able to get to the Firebase APIs, just like we need the jQuery CDN to get to the jQuery APIs. But we need more to be able to use Firebase. For instance, we have this bad boy, this config object, which has a bunch of stuff. It has an API key, which is a pretty crazy string of characters that you're probably not likely to guess. There's an auth domain, so that has to do with the name of your project that's generated. In this case, it's the fur or click counter or whatever that they generated for us. But when you create a project, you'll notice your project name is in this. The database URL, that's that URL I showed you in the console. That's it right there. Project ID, that's the project ID that we just created, right? So we'll recognize that as well. Storage bucket, this is just something that Google's using to store the data, yeah?
The link to jQuery and to Firebase, order is important or it can be different order?
Good question. Is the order important of how you put in jQuery or Firebase? No, not really. As long as they both come before your JavaScript, you're good. That was a great question, though. The reason why the order is not important is because they don't have really anything to do with each other. So if there was something that depended on jQuery, then you couldn't put them in any order. But Firebase does not depend on jQuery. You can do it with raw JavaScript. Then there's this message sender ID. Don't worry about that either. So you create this object, this config, and once you have the CDN linked to Firebase, you have access to this Firebase API, right? And you can call this initialize app and pass in the config, and voila, Firebase is initialized in your web page. Then what can you do? Well, we want to use the database features of Firebase. So the Firebase API exposes a function called database, and you call it, you go ahead and you get a reference that you store in a variable to the database. Now we can communicate with that database. Alright, so there was a click counter, which wasn't being shown on the UI, because it was just happening behind the scenes, but there's a click counter, which, you know, isn't too exciting. We've done that before, and what we're seeing so far with Firebase isn't too exciting. Yeah, okay, this web page is updating in real time as we're clicking a button, but theoretically it's just a click counter, and we can do this kind of fun stuff with local storage, which is true. So we have a click handler, nothing crazy there. We increment our click counter, and then we get to the fun stuff. Database.ref.set with some object. Okay, what is this? Well, Firebase has a scheme that it follows. So we have our database, right? So that represents the entire database that we're trying to communicate with. And then there's this .ref. .ref refers to a path in the database that you want to update or manipulate. So when I have .ref with nothing in it, it basically means the top level of the database. That's the absolute top level root of the database. So for those of you who are up to date with your database lingo, this is a NoSQL database, okay? Which means that it doesn't follow traditional relational database rules. And we'll get into relational databases in a few weeks when we go over MySQL. Not super important now, but when someone, you know, has that buzzword NoSQL, blah, 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 and they're bringing it up in an interview or whatever, you've used it now with Firebase, which is great because it's super hot right now. Everyone's like, yeah, NoSQL, wow. They don't even know what it does, but like, yeah, awesome. So this is a NoSQL database. And this idea of pathing, where you have a root structure of your database, does not exist in relational databases. It exists in some NoSQL databases, but not in something like SQL Server or MySQL. There's no path to anything. There's no root to anything. So anyway, what I mean by root? I mean by root is the entire database can effectively be summed up as a giant JSON object. So we've seen JSON, right? Where it's a bunch of properties. You can have sub-objects. You can have sub-objects from that. You can have arrays and values and all that fun stuff. The entire Firebase database is just a giant JSON blob is all it really is. And at the root, we have an object, right? We have an empty object. And this is the access to that root. And what we're doing is setting a property on that root called click count equal to our click counter variable. And that's why when I go ahead and look right here, we have our root, which is this for click counter 7cdv9. And then our root object has one property called click count that has been incremented, and sometimes it's changing too, which I'll explain in a moment. Click count that's changing, right? So this is that object structure. We're familiar with the object structure now. We're familiar with JSON. We know what that looks like, and Firebase effectively lets us represent that in the database form, which is pretty cool, I think. Any questions on this? So it's changing, which is the cool thing that we're going to discuss in a little bit. But basically, there are other people playing with this right now as well, and we can see them do it. So if that's not cool, I don't know what is, right? Already, just by using Firebase, you'll have the ability to build multi-user interactive environments on your web page without really doing a lot of work at all. And we're actually going to get into that today. So you guys are full-fledged web devs after today. Wrap it up. Let's go home. We're done. Anyway.
That paper for
Oh yeah, the certificate? Ah, don't worry about that.
Signed by all
Anyway, if we go to the Firebase homepage, you'll see this little overview. And on overview, this is your project, right? We're back on our projects. Click the little home icon, go to the overview. You're going to see these three icons. iOS, Android, and this fun thing, which is it's an HTML tag, right? An HTML tag? Yeah? No? Okay. Anyway, well, when you click on it, you get Add Firebase to your web app. Everything you need to get Firebase working in your web app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slack out that code I was just playing with, that Firebase click code, and you're going to update the config to have your database's config, and you're going to play with it, and you're going to see what the hell happens on your Firebase console when you click. So let me find that code and slack it out. Alright, let's see. Class content, Firebase activities is number 9. Yes, so number 9, in the GitLab repo, you can pull that one up. There's a config variable. If you're pulling it from the GitLab repo, you need to change the Firebase CDN link, because it's an old version, and the config. If you're pulling the one I just slacked, you should only need to change the config. And then what I want you to do, after you do that, so I'll go ahead and copy it. Woo, that's amazing. I'll open up that code again. I should be able to just come in here and hit paste. It's going to take the whole blob, but I only need the config because I have everything else. Can go delete this crap. Don't need it. Don't need it. Replace the config right here. You'll notice this is my test project now. It doesn't say the fur whatever, right? So if I go back to my Firebase, let's go ahead and open my database. Gotta scroll all the way down because it's super irritating. This is the one thing I found that's really irritating. I don't know why they make you do it. If I take that HTML page, no, not that one. Let me open that HTML page again. I figured out how to launch HTML from the command line on Linux, which is cool. I like that. Anyway, my click count starts going up. You should have a similar experience once you replace the config, and if you pulled from GitLab, you replace that link, where you can sit here and you can click me, and your click count goes up and up and up. So, while you're playing with this and you're updating your database, I want you to look at that code and pay attention to it. First of all, pay very good attention to the CDN link. You don't got to memorize it, but remember that it's there. Pay very close attention to the config and how you initialize your database, right? You initialize your application. That setup is really important. Yeah, okay, you can copy the code and get started real easily. That's true, but pay attention to it because there are going to be times where you'll forget one of them, I'm sure. Another thing to pay attention to is in that click count button handler, right? Where we're incrementing this click count in Firebase. Pay attention to the database.ref.set. .set is the most important one to remember right now. We're passing in an object, and we are updating the root of our database with that object. It's very important that we remember that. So go to database, and scroll down to the bottom and go to see all the Firebase features. This is real-time database. Go to scroll up. This one right here. Oh, it's right there. Yeah, click it. There it is. You can just click the copy button. Okay. Does anyone want to share on their experience of Firebase? It's pretty cool, isn't it? I know we haven't gotten into much yet, but it's extraordinarily powerful what we can do with Firebase. And to be completely honest, I started playing with it. I've known about Firebase for several years, but I was like, hey, I have some app ideas. Maybe I'll use Firebase to try to get them started. It's very advantageous because the whole idea of building an API and having to deploy a server doesn't exist, right? If you can just have this real-time updates with your data storage, then there's a whole lot you don't have to do to get a very responsive feeling app. I just have to build the client, and when I build the client, I now have full access to a database I can get to from any other client, and yeah, it's pretty radical what you can do with this thing. Has everyone got it up? Everyone been playing with it? Everyone kind of seeing what's going on? Fist of 5, how's everyone feeling about Firebase right now? Little wavy, got some good numbers. You don't gotta understand how it works. You don't gotta understand everything that's going on. But if I said, hey, create a new project, go on, take that code and put it in a new app, you should be feeling okay about that at this point. Kind of the idea of what Firebase is and how we're using it. All right. Okay, so now we've got Firebase. You know, we played with it a little bit, kind of see what's going on. We've seen that click counter go up. So, you know, what we did thus far wasn't too exciting in terms of what we're displaying or anything, because we could do a lot of it with local storage, and we could do a lot of what we're about to do with local storage too, and that is we have the ability to go in and update the UI with jQuery, right? And show how many times we've clicked. And you see it's resetting because people are doing stuff to it, as I am. So anyway, it's a similar example to what we just saw, but now we're playing with the UI. And there's another thing that's been added to this. When I refresh the page, the number of times that have been clicked shows up. And to know the number of times we've clicked, I have to do something. I have to get that value from Firebase, right? It's going. I'm not clicking it. Look at where my cursor is. There's another class doing this right now at the same time, and they're clicking it, and it's starting to piss me off because stuff's just happening, right? It could, I could just do it with my own config, right? Yeah, I should go in and delete it. It might be one of you students using the same one. Yeah, Adam?
So before I start clicking, I've got the arrow saying that click count is uploaded.
Yeah, you have to
Open the thing and click.
right click, open server on your code, and then click.
Yeah, I know. When I click
So, the Firebase, the first time you click, it gives you an error. Do you want to check it out, Stephanie? Yeah, so you should be overriding the value the first time you click, and it should be okay, but there could be some weird things.
I'm getting permission tonight.
Permission denied. Did you change your rules to public?
It says it's public.
Double check.
It says allowed. Everything.
It should say true or false.
I use the test database, which allows everything. So it says.
I would verify you're not using the Firestore and not a Firebase real-time database because they're different. Anyway, so what we're gonna do here is we're going to look at the difference. Whoa, there's a bunch going on here. All right. So now we're displaying this information on the UI. what we're going to do in a moment is I'm going to have all of you go through and kind of comment on this and kind of understand what's going on your own, but I'm going to talk about it for a bit. So we have the Firebase config again. Looks a little different than ours. We have the initialization. Okay, that's all the same. We have a reference to the database, and then we have the click counter. And then we have our click. That's all the same. Nothing's changed since the last example. But now we have another function. This on value. So that database ref that I talked about, where we get a reference to the path in the root object of the database. So we're getting the root when ref is nothing, right? When we don't give it a path. And then you can hook into this handler function, very similar to our onClicks, called onValue. And what's passed into the onValue function is something called a snapshot. And the snapshot is basically at that moment when this was triggered, you have a snapshot of the database at that path. In this case, it's the entire database, right? Because we're working off the root ref. But we have the view of the database in full at that exact moment. So we can console log the .val, and we can see what that will be, and I'll show you in the console in just a moment. We can also go ahead and take the .click count out. So look familiar, right? We're setting on that root the click count property to our click counter variable, and right here we're doing .val, pulling out the root object and grabbing the .click count property. They're a one-to-one relationship, right? Now you can't just use snapshot.click count because it's not what it is. It's the snapshot itself is a more grandiose object that has information about the database. .val, the function, returns the actual reference to the picture, the snapshot of the database at that moment, right? So the actual object that we want to manipulate. And then from there, I can update my click counter function, and then they have a nifty error handler if you need it, right? But we'll talk about that a little bit more. Anyway, the point is, you want to read the database, there's this .on function that is listening for changes, and what happens is .on will fire every time that value changes, and it will fire the first time it loads the database, right? So when you refresh your page, it's going to fire, pull that value in, and it'll update our page like we saw, and then every time you click, or anytime anyone clicks, it's going to update this on value and alert us so that our stuff changes. This is our read of the database at this point. So every database is effectively two operations, right? Read and a write. This is the read, and then the set is our write. Any questions on this? This code we're looking at right here? So it's actually, for all of the power we just got, pretty simple looking code, right? There's really not too much to it. And once you understand how the refs work, once you understand all these crazy references that are being passed around, it's really quite simple. It probably doesn't feel like that right now because there's a lot going on, and it's not simple under the hood. So you may be racking your brain at how does this work, and there's lots of different ways it could work. But the important thing is we can do a whole lot now. We can read and write these values. We can be updated from anywhere on any client of when these values change. So we have the ability to create chat services, right? You could build a multi-person broadcasting chat service where all of us were talking at the exact same time in a chat room with Firebase. Not a hard thing to do, actually. You could stream content. Someone could upload something to your Firebase service, and you could load it through Firebase as like the image URL or whatever, right? And then display it on the page dynamically. So you guys could pass images, which could get dangerous, I'm sure. You could do all kinds of things. You could have like a service on a web server somewhere that listens for stock market changes and then updates this Firebase database, and then your client will just ping, get the new changes, right? Nora, you have a question?
Would this also be used for like ads?
For ads? What nefarious things are you thinking of doing?
Like if you have a website and put an ad on your website, would you also use Firebase for it?
Maybe you could. There's no reason why you couldn't. You can use it for pretty much anything you can imagine. You would need to transfer and listen to data with, right? So what are some of the downsides to this? Does anyone have any ideas of what could be potentially bad about Firebase?
Useless apps.
Useless apps? Yeah? That people are just churning out?
Has passing malicious content?
Passing malicious content, yeah, that's definitely a good one because everyone's listening. Peyton?
Well, I was kind of wondering, because like, if you made something online, do all the users need read and write access to actually play it?
Everyone who's using it, yeah. So you have to have some way to lock down the database. There's more sophisticated ways to do it, so you could have people have to log into Firebase or whatever, you know, and it would work. But if you have it public like this, anyone can put anything. If they can find my config information, anyone can put whatever they want on my Firebase database. It's not open source. No, open source means we can see the code. But it is a free, publicly accessible database. Yeah, but, you know, it's going to be kind of hard for them to find stuff, but if you give it out, so say you have an open source project that talks to Firebase, well, now anyone can get to it, right? Pretty easily. They can abuse it. So if you're paying for the service, you pay for Firebase with bandwidth, right? So as you get more and more requests, Google charges you more and more. You're storing more and more data on their server, Google charges you more and more. And there's actually some horror stories of people having very successful apps written with Firebase, and one day they get 1 million requests, and Google's like, you owe us $90,000 tomorrow. And they're like, oh, shit. So this has happened with Firebase, and it very well can. So there are bad things that come with this, but for our purposes, there's not really many. It's a pretty powerful tool, and definitely worth learning and understanding. So what I want you to do is go to exercise number 10, this one right here, and I want you, with your groups, with your partners, whatever, go through and write comments at every single line and try to understand exactly what's happening with Firebase. When is it setting stuff? How is it setting stuff? If you had to build a mental model of what was changing in the database as a line of code happened, what would it look like? Spend a few minutes doing that, trying to understand this file better.
Firebase lab.
Yeah, it's sort of like a jQuery installation to the DOM, but this is that this is like security.
All right. Fist 5, how's everyone feeling about Firebase right now? Can we all comment through this example? Kind of understand what's going on? Feeling okay? I got about half response on that one, so I'm going to assume that means most everyone's feeling okay about it. All right. So if we could quickly go through this, does anyone have any questions about this? Now that they went through and tried to comment it, did anyone get stuck at a point and be like, I don't actually recall exactly how this works? Because we will clear that up right now, best we can. Anyone want to volunteer? Nope.
Why is the last function separated with a comma?
This one?
Yeah. Or has the first function snapshot or whatever, and the function error object has like a comma before it?
The second entry for database.
Right this? This one is what you're talking about, right, Peyton?
No,
Right here?
the very bottom one.
Yeah.
Oh.
I feel like that should be like a semicolon if anything.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's
Well,
good.
'cause
Good question.
It's still part of the call of the dot on click.
Yeah, this dot on value is an error is a handler, an event handler function, right? Just like your on click, and it has two other functions it can take in. It has a success function, and then this one is an error function. So when an error happens, this error function is registered as well, so you can read it. You don't need it, but then if an error happens, you don't know. This will never be called. So no, the comma there is correct. It's just multiple functions are passed into this. Make sense? There are two callback functions instead of one. Promises are similar, but we use .catch usually instead of the two callback function method. Anyway, we have a config. We set up our config. We get this from the Firebase website, right? There's no way you're going to guess it. Then we initialize our app right here. We go ahead and get a reference to our database, and we are just initializing our global click counter variable. Right here, we're setting up our jQuery click function. We're incrementing our click counter every time we click that button, and we're updating our Firebase database. What does empty ref mean? Anyone? The root? Heather? Yeah, nice. It's the root of the database object, okay? And we're setting the property click count on that object equal to our click counter, which will start as 1, 2, 3, and all that fun stuff. Then we need to initialize our loading stuff, right? So we need to tell our database that when the root gets a new value, we're going to update our UI. In this case, we have a function that takes in our snapshot. We go ahead and log out the snapshot's value, which is just going to be that root object of our database. In this case, we have one property, click count. We update our click value HTML element with the text equal to the click count, so we can track how many times we've clicked on our UI, and then we update our click counter, right? So if this click count gets updated by someone else, we want to be in sync. So what we do is we listen for those changes and we make sure that our variables are all in sync with that click counter. And then right here we register an error function, so if something bad happens, we'll know in our console and we can understand at least why the counters aren't updating. Yeah, Heather?
Okay, so if I get the snapshot correct, it's taking a real time, like at this moment, this is what it's iterating.
Yes.
If someone else has access to it, and then runs our code and iterates on top of that, so it adds to it. Is that what
I
it's
see.
doing?
No, this is a read-only operation right here that's happening here. It's close. What it's doing is it's taking a snapshot of the database at that exact moment that it's sending it to you. So it's saying, at this exact moment, this is what the database looks like. You can go ahead and do what you want with that, but it's not going to change here in this function. But if it does change, this function gets called again with a new snapshot that's different. So you can't actually change the database from this onValue function. You have to do it with the set. It's a very explicit difference in functionality. That is a good question, though. That is a great question. Yeah, the snapshot cannot be used to change the values in the database. You have to do a whole bunch of other stuff to actually be able to do that. Now, there might be some functions on the snapshot that do allow you to call back the database that I don't know about yet. But from here, the way we're using it, we do not update the database. And I'm going to assume it does not allow that. Any questions on this before we go ahead and start our first activity? Yeah, Kyle?
The second on ref get called, or how does it get called?
The second on ref? What do you mean?
The document where we're actually reading from the database?
Right here?
See how the click guy gets called?
This gets called when the values change in the database. So we're registering an event handler just like on our click, and it's being stored in memory, and every time something happens, that gets invoked.
So is Firebase sending the information back when something changes?
Yeah, so it's most likely a WebSocket. You know what WebSockets are?
Okay.
There's most likely a WebSocket behind the scenes that's listening.
So it's listening to check to see if something happens.
Yep.
If it does, then this function gets called up.
Exactly. Kyle, you got a question?
Yeah, for the if your database is empty
Uh-huh.
and it sends out these variables that automatically displays that variable in your database.
So if you read the onValue and your database is empty, you're not going to get anything. So if you were to try to read the click count, at that point it'd probably explode. But after you run a set once, you're fine. You'll have created it. So you need to run the set to create the variables. They're not just going to, or the properties are not just going to exist. But you could go into the console yourself and add them if you wanted to ensure they always did exist. Or you could have special functionality that's like, first things first, if these things don't exist, we're going to add them, right? So that's a great question. They don't exist off the bat. Do you have something else?
Yeah, I was just curious. So if it sends you like updates every time something happens to it, could someone theoretically spam it with a bunch of new information constantly over a period of time and break it?
And break it? So they could definitely spam it and cause problems, right? And I'm sure Firebase has throttling mechanisms to prevent that from being too bad. But theoretically, in a world where Google doesn't do their job very well, yes, they could break it because they could cause so much traffic that it would just bog down every client. Listen.
Almost like a DDoS.
Yeah, it'd almost be like a DDoS. Yeah, exactly. You could totally try to do it through Firebase, but I'm going to guess that there's some form of request management or throttling inside the Firebase servers that you can't do it too bad. Google will be like, what the hell? Or your service is paying for all that bandwidth usage, right? Because there'll be a point with all this free stuff where they'll just shut it down.
Right,
And be like,
that's kind of what I was getting at. Like,
Yeah.
at what point do they know, like, hey, this is not actually legitimate?
yeah, that's all on Google. However they decide to determine that, right? So there might be something in the license to say, oh, for a free version, you only get 10,000 requests or this much bandwidth per month. It's probably what it is. You know, you get 10,000 requests per month and, 10 megabytes of data or something. It's probably more than that, but, that's the gist of it. Okay, so we are going to do activity number 11. This is what it looks like. 100 clicks to go. And I will click this 100 times as fast as I can. This isn't a very good mouse. I blame the mouse. Oh my gosh. This mouse is small. And Woo, you made it. That's a lot of clicking. You bet it was, and then it restarts. Or you can click and hit restart, boom, and it sets the clicks to 100. So what you're going to have to do is keep track of Firebase. You're obviously going to have to initialize some value to 100. When you hit reset, you're going to have to reset the database to 100. When you get down to 1, you're going to have to make sure that it doesn't get less than that so that you can alert and then reset the database again, okay? So there's a lot of Firebase interaction we're going to be doing. You're going to have to replace, or you're going to have to add your own config to your own database in this, right? So you're going to have to set some stuff up and work with your own Firebase instance. Don't be afraid to use that Firebase console to help you through. But you got about 15 minutes, so let's work on this and then go from there.
Priority.
Yeah, for like body, like, and for like stuff on there for
I'm having a hard time. Database dot sat. Someone, I don't know what it is.
So you're pulling, this is pulling the
Most of the stuff, I'm not looking at previous examples, but I don't see where I have database dot net dot sat. Does that count as a database?
I ran across the same thing, I almost cried. Yeah, I was in a copy and paste like that. It's like set content from the other one, but yeah. It works because I use my database in the other.
Well, he may only put the issue where the same thing like Adam was saying, where if it's an old user, it will just go ahead and put up the console, but it'll keep going.
actual like Firebase, did you? So I have to like add a, I guess like variable to Firebase to like a, I don't know why it would be, but
I'm reading code at work now. There's a lot of same stuff to figure out.
Now you have to
Yeah, oh, then I can, just read that.
and update later that value. Get down to 1. Yeah, that's why it's not on my job, whatever.
well, are you using your own config or are you using?
On this clip. Now, it's true, if you use the
So it would have to have that initial like quick count.
All right. Let's go ahead and go over this. Fist of 5, how was this? This one was probably pretty tough. Okay, more mixed reviews. Yeah, this one was hard. This one was real hard. So let's take a look. What we had, what you guys had, was this. Bunch of comments. You need to initialize your database. Okay? You need to, on the initial load, you need to set some stuff. You need to set up your onValue function so you can update your UI. And there's a whole bunch of comments on how you can do this. And then you need to update Firebase. If you hit restart, you need to update Firebase every time you click, right? There's actually a lot of code you need to write. So let's go ahead and just take a look at it real quick. So the first thing first, we need to pull our information, our config information for Firebase. Then we need to initialize the Firebase app, right? Has to happen first. You can pull it off of that web page. Then we need a reference to the database. If we don't get a reference to the database, we can't change the database. There's a whole bunch of other things Firebase does. The database is just one of them. So we need to get the database out of the Firebase application. We have our initial value is going to be 100, and we're going to default everything to 100. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an onValue handler. And the onValue handler is going to load the current values of the database. So first we're going to console log it so we can see what the database looks like in the console. We're going to update our click counter to equal what's in the database at that time. We'll go ahead and console log it out to make sure we can see what the number is, and then we'll update the text in our click value with what's in the database. So basically what we're doing is we can restart from any point, right? So if you click 10 times, you can go ahead and refresh the page, and you can continue on from where you were at, right? You need your error handler so you can see if anything bad happens, because inevitably something eventually will. Probably not in this, but it's possible. This function right here is pretty much the meat and potatoes of what we were doing. Any questions on this code? Because I imagine this was probably the hardest bit. No questions? If I were to just try to use snapshot.clickCount, what would happen? Get undefined, you get an error, something along those lines, because snapshot does not have a click count. If I were to do snapshot.val.clickCount, what would happen? I'll definitely have a problem there because .val is a function, right? So if I don't call it, I don't get the appropriate value out of the snapshot. It'll be a problem. So right here, I have a reference to the database. So a lot of these examples have shown just calling snapshot.val.clickCount, but what else could I do? I could Put it in a variable, right? Now I have the database object, and I can just reuse it. Then I don't gotta worry about calling snapshot.val this whole time, because it's a lot of extra typing, and I have no idea why all those examples do this. Same thing, right? Snapshot.val returns the object graph at that point in time. The object graph is our database. In this case, we have the empty ref, so we know it's the entire database. Right? So our click count, it's in the top level, it's one of the first properties. We go ahead and pull it out, we're good to go. Alright, whenever a user clicks, we're going to reduce the number. We'll just go ahead and do a click count minus minus. If it gets to 0, whew, you made it, you know, good job, awesome. And then we can reset everything, right? We'll reset the initial, the click counter initial value, and then we can just update the database. Database, our click count is now something. When we hit restart, we're just going to go ahead and restart the database value to the initial value, which is 100. Call this database, you're good. You actually don't even need to, well, you might have to do this here. I'm not sure if value gets triggered if you make the updates. That's a good question. I don't know that.
Well, that's not value, that's setting the text, right?
What was that?
The URL, that last line text sets the HTML.
Yeah, this sets the HTML, but the question I was asking myself internally, out loud, was if I trigger the database ref update, will the on value still fire? And according to this, I'm going to say it doesn't, but let's verify. So why don't I hit console log, I clicked restart, and then on our on value, we'll see the on value come through, right? So if we open this in the browser, if I hit restart, I click restart, and then the on val seems to come through again, doesn't it? Oh, it actually doesn't. Well, look at that. We learned something new today. I learned something new. Anyway, the point being, this ref on value does not happen when you are the one to update the database. It does not get called again. So that's why you can't rely on it to do all of your work for you. You still have to manually update the UI, because if it happened for us, theoretically the UI would be updated right here, wouldn't it, in the on value? Every time I didn't, I would never have to update it anywhere else myself manually. Does that make sense? What I'm working through? Yeah. Any questions on this? Cool. Alright. That one was probably pretty tough. Let me go ahead and close these. Alright. We're going to move on to something a little bit more advanced. So let me go ahead and show you. Okay, so we're going to be changing up how we use this structure in Firebase. If you want to reuse the same database and you don't want to create a new app, you can. Go ahead and go to your console, click delete, and hit delete, and boom, you start fresh. Because we're about to kind of change how we use things. Oh my word. It is not going to add these two instances together, is it? Horrible. It's terrible.
Windows key arrow usually will snap into the side.
I'm not using Windows, dude.
Still works in Linux, dude.
Alright.
At least in Ubuntu it works.
So we are going to play with adding multiple properties to our database at the same time. So my name is Carson, my age is 26, my phone is 12345678890. It's my real phone number, believe it or not. Hit submit, and I get this fun text back. Well, what does that mean? I don't know. It could mean anything, I guess. If I go here and look at my database, wow. My age, my name, and my phone number are now in my database. So you're not limited to one property because, again, this database is just an object graph, right? It's just like the JSON objects we played with before. If we go ahead and look at the code, how is it different? Well, the difference is, instead of setting the object with just the click count, I'm now setting it with multiple properties. It's not much different, as long as you understand that this is an object, right? So you have to kind of build that abstract understanding of what exactly the database is for this to be simple, but it's just an object. So if you think about it that way, if you try to just remember that, try to think about it as not a database, but just an object store, that might make it a little bit easier. Anyway, I want to use multiple properties. This is how I can do it. I can put whatever I want in here. Hello, world. I mean, that's always going to say hello, world every time, but I've added that property now to my database. So already you can see how this thing can grow. I can put whatever I want in it. I can make it as big as I want, up to the point that Google starts charging me. I'm really not limited so much by myself as I am by Google. Those bastards. Cool. And then eventually you'll go ahead and get the on value. So I guess the on value is triggered by a set. I'm confused now. I don't really know exactly all the idiosyncrasies of Firebase. But anyway, the on value will eventually trigger. Yeah, and it is a webhook. It's a socket, most likely. But yeah, it's a webhook. But the question is, when you trigger these updates, do you also get the on value response? And sometimes yes, but sometimes no, it seems. It might be when you, I don't really know exactly when. It probably does, but whatever. Anyway, yeah, so that's multiple properties. And you can see to get them out, we call our val, and then we just access the properties individually, right? So if I wanted to go ahead and get my hello out, which would always be world, I can just go hello, because this val is just an object. And again, how do we know that? Because if I do var db, well, that is a da, db equals the val, I can go ahead and replace those with db, and I get the same thing, right? So if you look at it that way, it makes a little bit more sense, because then it's just an object. It's not a scary database anymore that that adds a whole nother layer of complexity to it, right? When you think about it as a database, it makes it more complex intrinsically, so it's harder to understand. Anyway, that's multiple properties. Any questions on this? Cool. Go ahead and pull up exercise number 13. I'll Google Chrome it. Google 13 solved. This one is recent. Alright, so what we're going to have is that sign up page that we did with local storage. You hit submit, boom, it's Carson, I refresh, it's me again, here's the default values, and in the database, it will be my information. So that's what you're going to be doing. This activity again, but now we're going to be using Firebase. Remember, you can clear out your local database if you need to, so you don't got to make a new project. Or, you can make a new project. Kind of up to you.
Yeah, so you
Yeah, like, one of those big ones,
the vote, between the profession that you're going to. I don't know what the cost of these like, so.
yeah, I didn't know that one,
I don't know how long it's for.
I think they could do that, they just got the other basic meeting.
Well, you could flag the basis.
Yeah, that's true.
So you do cross-up distribution for HTTPS, you flag the basis, your bucket with one file, main file. You could potentially run the thing with zero cost, except for the Firebase one. Because it's the developer here at AWS. Because once you cost them with HTTPS, you get 1,000 validations per month until you can update your app times per month so you can pay for it. So as long as your resources are paying a lot, you have it in your JavaScript that you can get deployed. After the first month, it's up to you, $50 the first month, and then you add in access and some of stuff.
Yeah, I don't even get any rest, it's not Friday, that's so actually one month, that's do the whole month, but I want to use my work PC for it, that's going to have something, and I could play ETS really more of it. It's like, yeah, it's everywhere.
But most people are saying that we would not so bad, and then if you understand over any country and find a good documentation.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was fairly easy to do, unless you get something wrong. I didn't know that, I think you got it, that's something different.
Something comes from the API gateway, especially with Lambda functions. Like a static hosting, like a stream of no big deal, Python, no big deal, easy peasy. Yeah. But you didn't Lambda functions, so it's fun. Well, stream of Python. We'll talk about AWS later on. But I was saying you can statically host a single page application like React, name AWS for effectively free, and then use Firebase to push your Firebase handler. So if you built an app, you had minimal usage from customers, you could host it for free for a long time before you started getting traffic to hopefully that point you're generating revenue from that, which is crazy. It's to be crazy. We've got like 5 more minutes on this. Got it? Stuck on anything? No? You are. No. Just tomorrow we'll celebrate. Charlie for camera. Firebase. Very awesome. There it's easy. You do database.ref. That's it.
good, man. It was great. Hey, over here. Stuck on anything?
Order logic for storing and retrieving.
Nothing?
I think so. But shouldn't that, the other thing I'm kind of wondering is that on value handler, like how does that function like activate when you just reload the page?
Like the first time you grab a reference to it, it's called.
No.
So the very first time it's called, and then every time the database is changed. So I confirm every time the database changes, no matter who does it, the value is going to get there. So if you change it, it doesn't matter what the data has to change. The reason why I wasn't working last event was I wasn't changing the data, I was changing the number or close to 100 of the data.
Oh, I see.
That's enough. There we go here. Making progress? Same problem there?
I thought you could use val because it was text.
That one's okay.
When I did the, even the.
Okay, you got that now.
File, there's some where they change the date. Yeah, like, are you watching? No, I'm not.
Okay. The console logs in your third is fine. Let me see the main display. Is that that's the input one?
Oh, like that. So that's probably, what is this not like?
Let's see. That's why. Never played this game. Looks like you got this stuff on now, so that's it. So now, create an object.
Oh, really? What? Yeah, what I had trouble with was the coding typing.
Coder, so I'm used to getting those particular keys.
Yeah.
Like 39 words a minute.
That one right there,
That's not that hard, but 50?
Yeah,
I did 2 words a minute since I was in high school and I took a typing class.
Regular typing job?
Yeah.
regular typing I can do that, but like that coding typing I barely scrape by, barely.
It's been a while to get to there, but I did like
Let's create an object, so if you bar item or
It was pretty tough. I think it was 30, you know, so I remember I was getting like 20s like for a while.
I almost had it on the library, I could type a good 100 words a minute or so.
Like I suck at typing anything on the top row up here. I like that.
I have trouble figuring out what
how do you upload to the remember that?
Theoretically,
So over the database dot
I
net.
don't know what it is about them, but it's really easier.
So right under the item that you just created.
Yeah.
So go ahead and call database.
Yeah.
Ref.
You want
And
to
ref is a function, remember? So has a few open close parentheses. Nope, you don't have to put anything in there. It's just open close parentheses. And then after that it's dot set.
I was just like sitting there typing and doing this, like, oh, I can type really nice, man. That's like, it's not that fast, it's just kind of like normal speed. I was out of computer 90% like, but I don't know that. This new job I got, there's
So the only other thing is
today was my
whenever
first day of
your
training.
database
It's just like
so right after you initialize your primary
it's
account,
like, okay, first you need to go to this website and everybody sees the sign in button right here, fine, and make sure everybody sees it. And it takes us like 30 minutes just to find that button and I'm like, oh god.
Firebase dot database. The database is a function. So you need to get a reference to that database.
Nope. Okay. click without a notice.
If you go ahead and hit the
And
click
then
handler, you should
I
see something
texted,
if
I
I
texted my boss and she said that'll make sure you're rehireable still.
Yeah, I want that like
Alright, we gotta go over this.
I went somewhere. I know less money, but
Let me open up the code.
it's like called 24/7 Touch. It's also like another third party call center, like outsourcing company.
Okay,
What, Parker?
this one was tough.
Yeah.
A lot going on here. So, first things first. We need to initialize our config, right? We need to make our config, get all our stuff from Firebase, and we need to do the initialize app call. Do the initialize app so that we actually connect to Firebase and we have access to the database and all that fun stuff. Then we need our reference to the database. Var database equals firebase.database, right? Database is a function. It needs to generate that reference. From there, we can go ahead and set some variables, initial variables, for us to hold our data in later. So let's build our click handler. And our click handler, what we're going to do is get our values out of the inputs, right? So we'll go ahead and pull the comment age email name out. We can trim them, which is a nice thing to do, get rid of that extra white space. And then we gotta call our database ref set. Remember, ref set takes in an object, and that object has the properties you want to set in the database. You call this, your database will be updated on every click with the values that you have in name input, email input, age input, and comment input, right? After that, we want to set up a watcher so that we can load the most recent data in the database, so we need to use our onValue function. So we have our database.ref.on, and then we have the value, so this is like our click handler for the ref, right? And then we have our function, our success function, which has a snapshot. You can go ahead and pull all the values out of the database with the .val function, right? So you call .val and then whatever the property name is. And with that, we can then update the text in our displays. Those displays are in that little card. And then just for sanity's sake, we have our error function in case anything bad happens. All right. Any questions on this? What was the major difference between this and the click handler example we just did?
Like multiple variables.
We had multiple variables inside that object. So it demonstrates that that root of Firebase is more complex than just a single handler. As a matter of fact, you can even go in here yourself oh, it didn't let me do that. And you can add stuff, right? Doesn't like the empty object. Here we go. Now I have a complex object inside of my Firebase database even. And if I were to reload that page, I would see it inside that snapshot.val. So this is a complex object. It's an entire object graph. You can do whatever you want in it. You can set properties. You can set other objects. You can set arrays eventually and all kinds of crazy things, right? I believe arrays have special handling, and we'll talk about them on the next session. But otherwise, the rest of the stuff's pretty much like building an object and passing it into that database.ref.set function. So remember, the important things. You need the reference to the database. You need the reference to the database that you have to initialize through the Firebase object, right? Firebase API. The database has two things we care about right now. .ref, which is a function, and then .set, which takes in an object. Then we want to have our watcher, right? So that .ref, again, we need an onValue handler, which takes in another function and allows us to load up the data from our database. If you don't have any questions, take a 15-minute break. Be back at 8:25.
Black that out.
Yeah, I will slack it out.
Just mine.
You gotta do a chapter. Did you
record everything they say, or would you record just the most recent comment?
That's on you, man.
I'm asking you.
I'd probably record everything.
I was thinking I would record, maybe use local storage to record the last 10 messages.
You could do that.
And only load the database the most recent. So the most recent goes to the other person.
Yeah, you could do that.
And then their current stuff is sitting in the local storage.
You could probably do, there's a bunch of ways. You could do all the messages, right? You could store multiple phases. You could store all the messages in chronological order, and then you could store all the messages by the user that sent them.
Well, yeah, that's what I was
You do it
thinking.
at the same time. So,
Store it by user, but not keep all of them. Keep maybe just
10 or so.
the 10 or so. 10 most recent. I guess you want to keep the 10 most recent. So if you close it and open up another browser page, you could actually see what the last 10 comments were from the person who was playing against and
Yeah.
what he said, what he replied to that.
Yeah. What's up, Rolando? You look like you. What?
Scopes of dynamic objects for the homework. So page loads. The array of buttons is created. All have to click in on it. But every button created after that is not associated with
Yeah.
why.
Well, you have to, when you create that on-click handler the first time, and you do your jQuery selection, it's selecting everything that exists at that moment as a handler. If you add something after that handler's run, who's to call that function again?
So, same thing for when you give standard on the page.
So there's a way you can get around it. We saw it on Monday or it might have been, or Saturday, where you can have a document on click, and you can tell it what to look for. And it can look for a specific class or specific tag type, and it can always assign that to that tag type after it's been created. That one's dynamic. So you can do it dynamically and just have one handler that's just always generated. Or every time you create that HTML element, you can create a new handler. But there's no way in the traditional creating click handlers to just be like, oh, everything that's created, go ahead and use it.
Yeah, pages help me with that.
Nice.
But we're doing like using jQuery to do like a select body dot on click, like you're selecting the body essentially of the entire HTML page, and then
Yeah, you don't need to do that. That's going to cause problems.
Yeah.
Because as it gets more complicated, you're going to mess something up. And then it's going to be really hard to figure out what's exactly causing the problem and when.
so we're to like reload all of those elements.
Hey, the function that you're creating the buttons in, so basically like what I did.
That's why I didn't have a
You create a function that creates those buttons, okay? In that function, you create, every time you create a button, you create a click handler.
Yeah.
And it calls another function that actually is gonna do what that click handler is
You can do that, yeah.
And that's what I did in my Star Wars game, and that's what I did in this one, this last.
Generate a new handler every time.
Each time they click on to add a new button, or I'm adding each time I'm adding a button onto the page, it adds a click handler engine that calls function.
So say you have a function that creates a button, right? And in there, there's a var element or whatever. Oh, I've got it up on the screen behind you.
Yeah, I was looking at that one over there.
Element dot on. Now make button has created a click handler, and I can do whatever I want in here.
Okay.
And if I called make button, it would create a new button that had a click handler.
Right, and then that click handler would click it.
Would say I'll just click.
Wouldn't say that, but if for the point of the homework, that's where you would put the call for the.
Yep.
The entire. Oh, okay. Yeah.
then load gifts actually goes out and loads gifts. And in this also,
I just
you'll
haven't done it
see
in any function.
this back here is adding a click handler for the gifts, which calls gift animate, gift animate. That's still an animate. So you, every time you create a button or create the gift, it actually adds a click handler to it. I figured that out in the Star Wars game.
I think those are the games, but just like that's graduation.
Well, now we did the slide solution.
Yeah,
I already wrote my bullshit, so it's
it's starting to make more sense now. What's the
I mean, I don't know, like the creating variables, just the placement of everything is just like, I'm just saying so just to modulate it all.
yeah.
Like I spent half the time just creating a JS page and I realized that I should just like export it in script.
You did it backwards than I did. You're trying to pull from the display and then you're updating the input, and I was trying to I pulled from the input but was also trying to update the input. Good job.
Okay, but at least I'm basically.
This will be called every time you update it. Doesn't matter who it is. So it doesn't matter if this is once it's there. Because you call this function, you register that handler. Now what you can do is stream yourself.
It's not popular here, but the functionality is not there.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So if I had called it this right here, it's possible that it would have called it every time you update it. I don't know what they're or oh, you got a if they don't destroy them. I don't know if they destroy them or hide them or whatever. Yeah, like that was just before the goalpost. They're thinking 60 yarders in the middle of the field.
That's the greatest thing I have ever heard you say.
Just landed just shy.
I was not expecting that sentence from my curly pants. No, I'm just looking at my I'm just looking at my homework code and then you're there typing something and you're gonna be like, what the hell, dude? And then say something relevant, dude. And nope. Right over it. That was amazing. That was thank you. So, would this work, Carson?
What? What? 25. Yeah, 6 minutes.
Can you say something for him?
Yeah. So this the function that makes the array of buttons, or yeah, the loop that makes all the buttons on the page initially.
I would say a new one.
We're just going to
That guy plays 7. Which is 7 players on the game. Normally it's 15, but they have a speed game. Does 40 minutes and it's only 7 players. He did really well for a little while. Because of the speed. Because when he's 50 yards, 40 yards speed. 40 yards dash speed. But after a while, they knew if he broke loose, so he just
They're using documents.
they don't get the ball.
Yeah.
Or finish 14 and then add this to it. Yeah, so finish 14.
I think what they realize is that the players are so grown later in life, their brain development is not so effective that they're not even evaluated.
You actually, like, for every, you need a forward, you need it for the response, right? Like, the team response.
You get up and you don't look straight, they say your ass off. They gotta do it
For every gift that comes back in.
Yeah, they run it, right?
It's in the drug.
Yeah, they do it now.
Okay, so every game they have a specific test that you have to pass.
So
You
I
don't
did
pass
that
it,
here.
you're done.
This is my performance that makes it
Yes.
much bigger. So I said, yeah, the actual
Pressure. Went running out. I saw the guy with the ball. Jumped to get in.
wherever you
Head first.
you're getting it back.
Concussion. He had a contusion, so they had to work and cut him open. Pressure and everything.
This is actually calling that attribute, not creating it, because you didn't put a comma or whatever the property should be. You gotta put a comma. I always set up a project.
Well, they bring in the first round pick with the Bears.
But I overlooked it.
He in the first play,
Honestly, this one,
second play,
creating the buttons on the page. There's actually a big search class thing that we did last week. That is pretty
make mushrooms, and then they just mop it up.
That's all you're
Like, it's like, yeah, 10 yards up, fetch, and then they like, there's one that they did like 50. Very famous, but that's like,
You're missing out one line. So now yeah.
All right, let's get back to class. Let's get started on our next exercise. So, here's how we're going to do this last exercise. This last exercise is going to be pretty tough. It's not meant to take the rest of the class, but I'm probably going to have it take the rest of the class. But if you finish it, or you feel confident you can finish it, there's a second part to it that then you can try to tackle on your own. And myself or one of the TAs can help you a little bit and give you a little bit of guidance before you move on to the next phase. But this is activity number 14 called the Coder's Bay. And it's basically like eBay we're going to be making. It allows you to make a high bid. Okay, so right now the highest bidder is Carson at a current price of $1,000. I'm going to make it Tom at $1,500. And if I hit submit, it says you're the highest bidder. Now Tom's the highest bidder. If I refresh, Tom is still the highest bidder. If Carson tries to bid again, but only does $1,200, and I hit submit, sorry, the bid's too low. It should not update Tom. If I refresh, Tom's still the highest bidder. Now what's exciting about this is if I open it in another tab, and I come over here, and I make Jake the highest bidder. Now Jake is the highest bidder. And it shows up on this other tab. I did this from somewhere else on my machine. This is what's cool about Firebase, right? I have multiple tabs open that work with the same app, and you can see it update in real time. If I get the highest bidder even higher, you'll see how it changes, right? So you're going to be making this. Activity number 14. I expect it to take most of the rest of the class, so we're going to come around and help you all. There's a lot to it. If you finish early, or if you're feeling really confident, check out activity number 15 when you're done on presence, and try to add presence to this application. Now what presence is, presence allows you to count the total number of connections to the Firebase database at a time. So you can basically say there's 6 people with open connections to the database, and you can display that number on your page. So you could show how many people are actively bidding at that moment. So that's a pretty cool thing, but it's a little bit more advanced, and it's not required for the homework or anything. So if you get to it, you get to it. We'll slack out the solutions to it at the end of class anyway. Otherwise, just focus on this activity for the rest of class. We'll get as far as we can. About 10 minutes left in the class. We'll go ahead and go over it, talk about it. Yeah, we'll make some progress. So, good luck.
Would you mind doing this one with me on this class?
Not at all. Let's go. Do you want to sit back there? So
Yeah, sure. That's fine.
You know, I always thought when you look like this dude, there's like the very first stream was like before we actually came to class. And then there was this dude named like Michael Fox. He was fucking with me a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I thought you were in the first time I saw you. And then you were sitting like in the back. I was like,
Oh, wait,
Following blast button, bigger button. Unless you, oh, you have a glass button in your HTML for your code.
The real-time database after I close it.
You guys know console.firebase.
Yeah, so I'm at it right now, but that's just because I just created it. Let's say I go forward a page or something. Like, how would I go back to that same database that I already? Now it's here.
Okay. So you should just be able to do it with that
I guess the last one is the same.
This is activity 14, by the way. Activity 14, not 16. You know, 16 is called code red.
Oh, okay. So you can't query your div buttons because it's all of them. You have to query the this attribute of one of them. Same stuff as this. Yeah, because it's specific to the one that you're clicking. Because if not, it doesn't know which one to search for if you had more than one button.
Not really, but it's my own code, so.
Well, if you know what to put where, then I guess understanding it enough.
Probably has about 45 words. That's
Oh, no.
I figured it out. Something plural. So this is the thing.
But it should still work with this. I don't know why it's not. Also, I guess because you only have one button. Why would you get a second button? Why would because that button is what we can on it. Why would it function? That's what you need to do.
Alright, so we've got the
I don't know how
button.
you do it.
I had my right and then I got rid of my right.
How are they going to make your button? This part right here is fully down to the button.
Passing it into the side there.
Can you go to add your item?
Firebase is less difficult. When you care about the data,
Oh, well, and I kind of did that with the render button situation.
Firebase is the database. Firebase
So it renders the button, it's just not creating the button. So I just need to put that in, is that what you're saying?
it tries to value one. Go ahead and
It's frozen.
This has happened to me like the last 4 times I've tried to insert this stuff. Like, it just shuts off. And then my code
Remove the bottom script handler.
I did that too. Makes it worse.
Remove the script handler. Oh no, the only thing it's not doing is not registering. Go ahead and manually just hit this one to look at except for the missing. It's probably been depending on variable related. I don't have a variable. You're gonna work with it. It does the same thing. Yeah, that's awesome.
Already got there. Add that value to your
And I did that, but it's a push.
script tags.
Well, you have to.
Why it's breaking.
can figure it out.
Yeah, uncommon.
Oh, I guess.
Outside the function, so maybe I need to put it in a function?
No, no.
Is that
Well,
right?
'cause
Well, yeah, and I did do that, and I can do that real quick.
well, you can. Well, I guess.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, 'cause you need to call this in order to make it. And the minute. Oh, I guess.
Okay, so you're already. Oh, okay. So what we want to do is
Okay.
But it
That
doesn't
might.
do it on the initial.
That might be where you get.
the value setback.
Not the generic.
Maybe now that there's a array actually there. One thing that I was trying to copy them. They were right for the.
I don't know. I'm done.
Okay, so oh, it's not next to yeah, I haven't used that database,
Yeah, this is a total. I just went back to a working file, figure out what's good. Zero.
So I need to go in there and make sure that it's actually iterating through the array.
basically there.
So I can use it. It's like I'm
No, I
debugging crap, like rather than actually working on the project.
This is very similar to an event list, where it's saying,
Yeah.
That is awesome.
I was
That's
trying to
tell
come
my
up.
people.
I was trying to come up with like some song quote and I couldn't, and then you said something, and I was just like,
and that's what's happening. And the next one that you're getting back from the database.
I can go like a bunch of this stuff down.
So, yeah, so that is the payload log. Okay, so what you want to do is set high points to snapshot. Yeah, snapshot. Yeah, but it's gonna be.
Because now it's not a.
Oh, I know why. This is a JavaScript file. You were an HTML file.
Awesome.
There.
Cool.
Took me a minute too. I was like, what? But they look the same. Why is it not working?
Now let's
You're
go
right.
over this now that time's up.
That's cool.
Jesus. Might get yourself that footage.
Better than somebody else.
It's true, it's true.
Ah, that's what we're doing. So we call dot bow. We're extracting that response. We're extracting the JavaScript object by the dot bow method. So we call dot bow, we have a property. So if we go here, we get an object right? So we put a curly brace. We put a curly brace here and a curly brace here. But remember, here we're not talking about. So this is actually an object. If you think about it. So what you're doing is you want this is called snapshot. This is an object called snapshot or snapshot.bow actually. And then what you want to do is you want to access one property in here. So what are the properties we want to access? They're going to be
How does that variables for?
snapshot bow.
In random top, can be variable. Firebase.database.
Yeah, no, I have that.
Oh, and then you reference it as part of the database file.
We're gonna more wrap that in it twice again.
I think when you've got valve,
It's easier usually to go back one.
Good old fashioned.
let's get this, not, I mean, like, all three of us have.
No, I
Exposure to this database. Snapshots are just passive, so as long as your callback function has that as an input, then it's snapshot. It could be called move a binder, but
Right, but
in the
here
example,
it's asking us to set the variable for how to get it.
if you wanna do that based on.
Right in between the,
Well,
Wow, high price.
I didn't see it, I was like, well,
so, that's where you.
The snapshot is the database setup. That's why you only, so it was already written for you to look at database.ref.on. That's why you set your Firebase database to something. And then inside there, you always refer to it as snapshot, which is then snapshot. And you would go snapshot, and then you want the value of something in the snapshot, and then you go dot whatever the value of the
Does that go in the proof?
this when you call snapshot, you're theoretically calling your database dot reference dot value of.
oh, yeah.
I use the same configuration region.
Do you have to be out your old one?
No.
Right, what I mean is
So like now it's not gonna use my
All of the.
You gotta find out what the name of the value. Use the inspector, you can either inspect it using Chrome Dev or with your API.
I watched on the first one.
Yeah.
I heard there's some Postgres. Yeah. Pretty much all of it comes back and all, and then you're before you get to do all the applications. But the other one are just So yeah, I was not
Now your initial reinitial.
She plays a villain in and like right at a pivotal moment, right in the middle of the series. She actually she opted out of her contract. She committed one too many things to her writer.
I'm done watching straight, but they bring him back.
Yeah. It's not like, you know, all the people at the end. Bring all of them back. Why did you do that?
I've seen some episodes like I'm not fond of it.
Well, it's all the way they do
Everyone is into it. You know, it's like super cool.
We did a Deadpool on
Oh, the Invisible Man. That. And you have to really be paying attention to catch that. What if they bid a number that is less than the current bid? I'm not saying it worked, I'm just asking if our bill came out. They all of a sudden but for now, I mean, you may not need to worry about that. But so far, yeah, everything you have looks like it's on track. Yeah, because because all they're saying here is if it's not populated, then just set it to, so like if you're the first client ever to log into the database, you want to set it to some initial number. You just basically redo. You have to find an example of where we're setting something, some value in the database. That's just setting it locally in a variable. You can do it by the database.set. Yeah, that's one of the things, one of the downsides of doing this with just filling in for existing code is that when you go to write from scratch, you miss those. I think they need to have a couple of exercises before they let you loose where it's just like 5 different words that go from scratch.
Forward or backwards? Go back. They have prior training.
Yeah, so this is what I was trying to do. So I was higher than my price.
Why in some examples do we have a snapshot down here?
It depends on what you are, where you're at in code. So like if you're inside, this is where, this is setting on function for if a data comes in the database, it's gonna call this function.
Well, that division that's why they carry
So this is all happening without you clicking anything on your page, right? This would be if something in the database updated, and it could be like, if you guys are logged into this database, and he changes the value, you're gonna see it on your page. That's what this is doing. Does that make sense? Now, on the flip side, when you click something, this is the click handler for when you see the bid on your account. So now you're not going to use a snapshot because you're not going to send us anything. You're just using the click handler. Lots of times they just grab the value and do it. That answer your question about when you use snapshot when you go? Yeah, really? Or yeah, you're saved here.
all of this stuff.
Ask questions, that's what you're here for. There's no stupid question to ask.
I don't think it's gonna close every time.
Some of it does. So what do you have for your card? Inside your snapshot, look right your all that function. Snapshot.
It's like 1.9 trillion. See what's happening here.
So for that piece, it's fine. Here, all they're saying is
You're basically the
so if you go up to the top, see that initial bid, initial bidder?
database.ref.com. Basically tells the database anytime there's an
So
update.
the database update, send it to text, like
Everyone. I don't know either.
And we're not, like for your personal little job.
So every time you update the price, you have to do a data.ref.com.
answer any questions.
Now, data.ref
So you're actually tracking the number
got
of people
set
that
Oh, okay.
sets in essence root afterwards, and then I just call database.ref, and then actually pass it on to one change. Change that out. Without thinking about it. Do we get rid of that curly bracket and just set parentheses and then just the value of the name? Updating.
If you're setting an object, then when you pass it the object or either set it to just open format, it does.
I just want to set the value, right? Because if we go dot ref and it's all.
Because they're legacy systems. Here's the measure.
So the really big ones, the little ones ready to cut, and the ones that are ready to loose it up, without trusting them at all. So they're really good quality. But behind the scenes, the old stuff is still there. So
You're at the right place.
It's sort of like I know some people are, but so, but yeah, they got that.
I don't see anybody's gonna be using Pearl. If you can go to Pearl. No, I just said Pearl. No,
Yeah, and they're using practical abstraction, relational language. Really old stuff. The other stuff that Larry wrote besides that stands for practical abstraction, relational language. It's like SED graph. No, it's like SED graph. SED graph. SED graph is the original files and other kinds of files. Adding strings, replacing strings or stuff like that. Pearl is a combination of all of it. Because if you want to go to the text, then you do change. There are some variables going on. So your name was in, but you want to change that name because you're passing that file off. Something like point out your name on it. Now, if you just want to find out what files in the name exist,
high bidder and high price in here.
it actually advances it now where it actually
Yeah.
they're starting to move that shop.
Use Go. That's totally wild. Because you use one but you show up there.
Unless they're writing something really fast.
sorry, my screen is talking. That's why with that soup, I read like
You got booted, man. You got booted.
High price of side band, rated strength density additional 0 kilowatt. So when that's updating from there.
I think that you. So basically what's happening here is you're opening the database and you're saying when a value changes, any value from that database changes, at the same time, a pivot on the one day where the current value is. So if you're gonna hit that,
Basically, it's saying there's something to do with the APIs in one domain. You're on the file.
so here is, so you're using the database and you replicating the DOM. So what we want to do here is we want to replicate. Now, finish your
14. So you're almost on 16?
Oh, it's all good.
I think there's even ways on what's up Firebase for on the computer, if they get into it, just go look it up. Right?
So they want you to save out the values.
Well, I guess we can, what you do is you can they got the time.
You're reassigning the value. So remember that you're doing a snapshot. Your access that snapshot you're using val to access the JSON object. And then you're using .type price as your access to the value. So
Make sure you get the right tag.
snapshot.val, you get like an opt-out.
Oh, okay, so
But instead of name, you are definitely going to use
what you're going to do here is get the values changes. So instead of grabbing a time/price, yeah, you'll grab time/price. Yeah. So you grab time/price, and you'll set that you'll set that using a jQuery value system, the value that stores the variables that we made.
Other things that we updating the database, even if that is
So,
if it is less than 100.
value and then we want to do the other.
So this code comes back to where?
But then it's referring back to that whole.
Your setting
It's
now
checking to see if your data is the highest bit.
So that's
If it's
It's a little bit awkward.
You're gonna like
and then
variables
you
and objects and all these things.
I was
Just like checking for data, checking it higher bit.
Yeah. Well, Zipper can be used for other things, but it's
So
primarily DOM.
essentially instead of doing it
Yeah.
instead of
You were like
high
almost
bit,
there.
it has to be high bit.
It's not gonna show anything right now. Yeah, because
I think the only thing that really affects is that hit check right there.
it's because you're
That check they put up on top to check to see if the database contains that.
oh wait, hold on. You have this on there. Okay, so then it should be the same.
The one thing I don't get about this is like, I mean, not that I don't get it, but it's like if, say I deployed this website somewhere, where people like pay it, right? If they saw my JavaScript, they're like, okay, this is a Firebase call, but they're just reading through my JavaScript, and they're like, so let's just go ahead and write a whole bunch of new stuff, and they're not even excited about it.
Don't do that.
Well, just because it's my work laptop, so now I've got to send it back. Did you really?
I feel like it wouldn't really be that hard to like,
You're updating the database, that's it.
Is it your battery swelling?
It's going to hot log or something like that, they turn it on after. That's the last thing you want to do.
well, you can see JavaScript association with plastic. Being a plastic, like the plastic end of it went. I think like I would look at just like the Firebase one and I go over here search and I drop it in the console and you go page and then it has them all up there. So when I got my home, I took off all the pages and I looked at them like, the Swiss is actually stuff that's never been used. Like I can all your bottom place, but it's really stuff at the bottom place. Like the plastic part is still threaded, the screw's still threaded there. So, right, then the thing that I just had to just snap. So like I can still take it off and fire it. Yeah. Are you serious? There's plastic on the inside? What? Why is there plastic on the inside? Especially like in the, so I mean like just like video cards and everything. Well, like it absolutely melted and snapped. Then the plastic variable. I ran it 2 hot week 1 and it went. Cool story, man. I gotta send it back to a week.
Yeah, nightmare. And it never is like, oh, we'll just back you up and here's a new, no. So it's sort of.
No, they were like, oh, so this happened in July. I just said in July. I bought it like the last, like a week before this started. So then I was like, I emailed it, I sent the customer support ticket, and they're like, oh, we don't have a resolution for your issue at the moment. We have to wait till the end of August. Like, what? I need to send this back, and it's fixed. I need to deal with it. What do you mean you don't have a solution? That's the solution. Take it, or give me a new one, and take this one and fix it and refurb it. I don't care. It's a month old. And expensive. Yeah. And already paid for it too. So I just feel like that can happen. We got i7. There could be some ways to run it, but like complex. Not there. Oh, this is, it's fine. It's fine. The problem is, like I was telling you, the bottom chassis is thread into a brass.
threaded holder, whatever, like goes like this and holds it. It's brass, and then around the brass part is held by a plastic connector to the chassis. Yeah, like like plastic, the brass next to a heat sink. That's when you're yeah, I'm not an engineer or anything, but I'm pretty sure you should put something that gets up to 85 degrees Celsius next to some plastic. Top computer.
It's in California, right? It's California. 283
Shit, it's freezing. And up to coffee. Yeah, that was pretty weird. So like 30
right, and that's how you're gonna update that.
Like, yeah, in Arizona right now,
Okay, okay.
40 or 50 something Celsius.
Like, why would you do that? Like, very good. So what I normally do
So to snapshot that valve and pipe there, we have technically instead of doing it in not the database rep set, you just need to make the pipe interface right. So you're trying to
It works. But I just do this bottom part here where it wants you to set it to where it wants. I don't know why I would just set it to
high price and bitter.
unless I'm technically doing it bigger than it is.
So which one are you trying to do? You're trying to so now that database rep set, you don't want to do it there where you have left. You're definitely doing it there.
Yeah, so what they work with is
Go ahead and finish your value.
so you actually
That was looking good. That's probably okay. Probably ready to move it. It's okay. But you're updating my think about when you did
Because I'm setting it. This is just updating the actual.
Oh, okay, yeah, they did that that.
Right, but anything else, because it's testing if it exists, so I put my set here so that it sets it to the initial if it doesn't exist on the database.
Yeah.
And then here I'm just updating that No, like, yeah, well,
Because it wants you to store it. So basically, what it's doing here is it's having you set that for one month.
doing it one off.
Yeah, you're reading this one has like reset the XP amount. Before you get the response back from the database, it says,
Right.
to
just gonna test the price, and if it is, it's just automatic.
Yeah, so I guess, but because we're putting it 13 million. Okay, so what you're saying, you're asking in this one,
Because this is testing if our database check if the entry exists, then
and high prices.
take the snapshot dot value of that. But I guess maybe because there's only one person. Because like it right now it'll update everything when it works correctly. Yeah, that's zero here. It tells me that I'm the highest. It hasn't updated the database yet though, right? Because it's checking first. Checks, it checks, then it alerts if you are. And when I hit OK, it's gonna. Well, when I hit OK,
Oh, it already
I think it's because
It's not like it's not like you have to share visit my website. It's not like we actively do.
I'm older than so. It's like okay, positive, gives it right back to me.
Yeah. And this one,
Like if you submit something after. Right, yeah. You put a space somewhere or something that it can't. Today, I had absolutely no clue how I would get that to work. I was thinking about it like how in the world would I create like something where two people would actually go and like
All right, we got to go over the solution, or you'll never see it before we leave class. So Coder Bay.
Yeah, that's why I was slightly confused. I'm like, well, I have all the functions
Alright.
already.
So what's important in this HTML file? Only that you update this Firebase link to the newer version if you copied it from your database. Did you need to do that? I don't know. The old API might have worked. But if you replace this with the version 5 API that we're using in our databases, then you're more guaranteed to get the proper functionality. So odds are you didn't have to do anything in here, but to be safe, we've updated that link. Anyway, let's look at what we had to do. First things first with Firebase, we need to create that config, right? So we need to pull that from our database. We need to go onto the Firebase website and get that information. Then we always initialize the app. You know how in jQuery I always say start with the $, when in doubt? Well, in Firebase, start with initialize app, when in doubt. Because without it, you're not doing anything. Then we need to get the database. So Firebase isn't just a database. Firebase is a set of services that started with the database. We're using just the database in this class, so we need to get it out of the Firebase application, right? So boom, pull out the database. So we have some initial values. We have our initial highest bidder and our initial highest price, which is 0 and no one. And then we're given this database ref on value. This is the load and the read function. So the first time this code is hit, it loads the data from the database, and then it'll happen again every time you update the data in the database. So it's our reminder that something has changed, and it gives us an opportunity to update our UI. So we're given this code too. If the snapshot.child high bidder exists, so if there's a property in the database called high bidder, so this is how you avoid those problems of just automatically checking val.highbidder and getting an error. Because this will basically say, hey, if the high bidder actually exists, we can use it, and if the high price exists, we can use it, otherwise just ignore it, right? If they exist, you can pull them from the value, you can pull them from the snapshot value, which is the database, right? So high bidder now equals the snapshot val.highbidder. The database is high bidder. And for high price, we can pull that out as well. For safekeeping, we use the parseInt function to do what? To make sure it's a number, right? In case it was a string in the database, which is possible. Using parseInt when you want something to be numbers, not a bad idea, because then you can kind of guarantee that it happens. So we have a high price and a high bidder that we pulled from the database. Snapshot.val, high bidder, snapshot.val, high price. We use the parseInt when it's a number. So we have the high price and the high bidder. What do? We console log them for safekeeping, just so we know, so we can verify it in the console. And then we update the HTML text with jQuery. Good old jQuery, our friend, our love. All right, so we've read the data. We know how to do that. Now what do we need to do? We need to update the data. When do we do this? When we click that submit on our web page. So we have two text boxes. We have a bidder name and a bidder price. The bidder name is going to be whatever. The price is going to be some number, right? So the first thing we got to do is get those values. We need to get our bidder name from the bidder name input, and we need to get our bidder price from the bidder price input. To be safe, you should use parseInt every time you're getting a value that you want to be a number again, right? I don't expect everyone to get this. I didn't expect everyone to remember this, and sometimes it would work anyway because the number elements in HTML come back as numbers. They're supposed to. But if for some reason it was a text and you were allowed to put anything else in there, but you wanted it to be a number, you'd want to use parseInt. So we use parseInt to convert the bidder price value to a number. Now we have the bidder name and the bidder price in some variables. We're going to console log them just to be sure. Console log when in doubt, so you can see everything that's going on and you can verify it, right? Like I said, when you don't know what's going on, console log. So we got this code. Bidder price greater than high price. It's the code that they gave us. If this is the case, that bidder price that we had entered in on the HTML page is higher than our initial high price, which we defined up here, right? Here's that high price. If it's true that our bidder price is greater than that high price, we can enter this condition. We're going to get a nice alert. This lets us know that it happened, right? You're the new highest bidder. Good job. You're spending your money on this thing. Now we can update the database. This is where we use that database.ref.set function. .set takes in an object and sets the values in the database. In this case, high bidder and high price are what we want to set in the database. So right here, why wouldn't we use the high price value? It's a circle. It's already what's in the high price, right? It's already what's in the database. We need the new one, which our if condition, it says, is the bidder price. Right? It says that right on line 60 there. Our bidder price is the new one. And our bidder name is what we pulled out of the bidder name input, so we might as well use it, right? If we use the high bidder, we'd get what's in the database already. We wouldn't be doing a whole lot. So we can go ahead and console log those again just to be safe. The else condition is already built for us. Sorry, your bid is too low, you suck, you can't buy this.
Did you modify this file or just load it?
This is the solution they gave us. I didn't make any changes.
And this is the bottom part about writing it out to the
Well, because our initial start file was a little different like that. that if snapshot.child highbidder exists, it had an else clause in it where they.
Oh yeah, where you're supposed to update it.
Well, no, but like that's where I'm creating. Remember, that's where I created my actual database entries. Because if it's testing if they don't exist, or if they exist, do something to them, and then else
So,
if they don't.
that's a good
leave
point.
it there.
So there was an else. And in the else you could do database.ref.set high price equals 0 and high bidder equals no one. Right? You could do that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. Do you need to do that?
No.
Why not?
Well, because you're setting it. You're doing in your example. You're doing it on the on-click portion.
We're doing it in the on-click, right?
Yeah.
Until that on-click happens, we don't need to actually have a default value because we're just going to default it to the initial values, right? So we have initial price and initial bidder already. And the snapshot saying if those things don't exist, don't reset those variables. So we're just going to set the high bidder and high price to the default values. So we don't actually need that else statement at all. So the solution here kind of refactored things out for us and made it a little bit cleaner. In here, we're actually setting the high bidder and the high price in the database, and this is where those default values, those first values, are actually being set. So we'll slack this out. Are there any questions? Cool. On Wednesday, we're going to go over Firebase some more. So spend a little bit of time tomorrow maybe looking at this and remind yourself of how it works because we're going to go into it again. Otherwise, have a nice night, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.